The Arabian Racehorse Podcast with Debbie Burt.
Hi, and welcome to the second edition of the Arabian Racing Podcast. Joining us again from Dubai is Stephen Molyneux.
Hi Debbie, how are you?
Yeah, all good. And so we're going to take a look at the first race of the season, which was the Wafba Stallions Cup Maiden Stakes at Wolverhampton over 7 furlongs. And what did you make of the race, Stephen?
I don't know. It's probably the sitting on the fence answer. I suppose any early season maidens, they get stronger as time goes on. But I think a pleasing aspect was that a couple of them came clear, Farasa and Aldana, and always good to see dominant horses come to the fore. And they were 6.5 lengths clear of the third. The second horse had obviously finished second in Belgium previously, so had the experience and some sort of form in the book, which very difficult to quantify. But no, I think the first two are probably quite decent, and there was 1 or 2 notable performances in behind. So time will tell how it worked out, but I'm guessing James Owen is just delighted to have kicked things off with a 1-2, which was such a common happening last year.
When I spoke to James Owen after the race, he said that Farasa had been quite backward last year, and he would never have considered working the 2 horses together. So I think he was quite surprised. When I was editing the pictures from the race, I did think that looking at the horse's face as she crossed the line, it looked like she probably had a little bit more in the tank there. It all sort of penny dropped really in the last couple of furlongs for her, and she made up quite a lot of ground at the end, whilst the other one clearly knew what was going on and certainly looks more professional. And James wants to step Aldana up in trip, he said afterwards as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with the winner, it looked as though she was learning on the job, doesn't it? She's making up 4 or 5 lengths. And I didn't watch all of Wolverhampton, but I did read the odd report that there was quite a strong headwind. Don't know if that was true, and very hard to quantify how it affects the horse, but maybe Aldana just paid the price a little bit for going for home into that teeth of the wind quite early on in the straight, and just left herself a touch vulnerable late on. But no, that was good performance from the front too. In terms of how I'd rate that race, is very difficult. I kind of have 3 bands for maidens, and I think anything rated 70 to 75, it was probably a below average maiden, then 75 to 80, kind of your average maiden, and then anything above 80, probably quite a strong maiden. So I'm likely to go somewhere in the 75 to 80 bracket as it being an average maiden, and see how it works out.
I can certainly confirm the strong headwind. We had a lot of trouble. So we've got a roller banner for the sponsors to put up behind for the Tracy presentation, and we actually had to put it down and move it in order to take some pictures in the end, because it was threatening to take off, and certainly it would have frightened the horses and probably destroyed the whole race. So it was pretty windy that day. Just looking at the other horses, I thought Sahis travelled well for quite a long way. You may have noticed that Alex dropped his whip, which obviously wouldn't have necessarily helped his chances. I don't think that perhaps he would have troubled the winner, but certainly he'll have learnt more from that race. Of the lesser high-profile horses, despite the fact that one of Jen Harris's didn't load, I was quite surprised at how well Chameleon broke. She was one of the more professional ones actually out of the gate. So in her own class, in handicaps, she'll probably do a little bit better. And again, horses that didn't break well. Al-Qadir, obviously gelding probably hasn't been enough to sort his focus out. I was, disappointed with him because he's very nicely bred, but he's certainly going to need a further education if he's going to do anything further this season.
Yeah, I mean, just Sahis, the first one that you mentioned there, I think again running into the teeth of the wind wouldn't have helped him. I thought he probably travelled like the third best horse in that race, and it was a case of Al Simsam, who eventually finished third, just kind of picked him off in the straight. It was you almost try and assess 2 or 3 different races within one race. You've obviously got the front 2 who were much better than the rest, and then maybe the eventual 3rd, 4th, and 5th who had their own little race, and then the rest of them. So I definitely take Sahis forward. He'll get a handicap mark after this race. It's obviously we're doing things a little bit different the last couple of years, in that horses only need to run once in a maiden to get a handicap mark, and as long as they show enough for me to have a sort of educated guess, then they will be rated to give them more opportunities. And unfortunately, in the case of maybe Amy, who finished tailed off last, there's just no real clue as to what to rate her after that initial start. So she'll probably have to run again in a maiden, which I know must be quite frustrating for trainers who probably don't feel as though, the horses are capable of winning a maiden. At the end of the day, probably only 20-30% of any horse population capable of winning a maiden. So we're trying to get them rated as soon as possible to give them more opportunities in handicap. So the first 6 in the race at Wolverhampton have finished close enough to give them some sort of mark. Obviously, El Anwar's a 3-year-old, so that one won't get rated until July anyway. Chameleon, as you mentioned, has already got a mark of 40, and fair play to Jen Harris for having a go at the maiden, for all that she was never likely to be good enough. Obviously, not too many handicap opportunities, and yeah, like I say, it's probably only going to be Amy who's not going to get a mark on the back of that run.
Absolutely, and of course she did duck rather violently.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so she didn't have a lot of chance. In fact, to be fair, Howard Chang did well to stick on, I thought, having looked back.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just a run that, unfortunately, you can't really glean anything from. So you've almost, well, you do have to see her again in the maiden. And like I say, unfortunately, probably going to be quite green again the next day, and again not showing much. But at least you can justify giving a handicap mark after 2 runs and get them into their rightful grade as soon as possible, which we'll allude to when we discuss the Bath race. There's 1 or 2 in there that are far more likely to make an impact in handicaps rather than the maidens they've been contesting.
Of course, and if we move on to that first handicap now, I think for some of the people who are not familiar with the way our handicapping system works in this country, although it's a 0 to 70 handicap, the top weight in the race is actually rated 72. If you'd like to explain a little bit more about the extended handicap system for those who might be confused.
I've honestly got no idea why they've done it, to be perfectly honest with you. Obviously, to give more opportunities, I guess, but it's obviously we're following the BHA and the way they do it, the thoroughbreds, in allowing. So essentially, as you said, it's a 0 to 70, but anything rated 71, 72 can run. I believe if we were to ever get a full field, they'd be the first ones balloted out, but I don't see that as being too much of an issue for us this year. But yeah, I guess increases opportunities for certain horses. I think.
Moving on to the track there, on the Racing Post website, they give the ground as being watered. I think pretty much everybody knows in this country that Bath doesn't actually have a watering system. So I checked in with Willie in the Arrow office to find out whether he could give us a bit more information. And the BHA website, on the course description, they say that in preparation for racing, that the course has been vertidrained, which for those that don't know is basically a big spiky thing that goes around behind the back of the tractor, and the spikes go in the ground and they vibrate. So it breaks the ground up and helps with drainage and easing of the soil structure. And it's been lightly irrigated, which pretty much all we can think is that actually they've gone around with a Bowser. Which
bloke with a hose.
Yeah, a little bit more than a bloke with a hose, but to be fair, actually in the West Country here we've had a reasonable amount of rain, but not enough to change the going. I think basically it will be as described, which is firm, but it should be safe, good, safe, firm ground. So the horses that we've got, quite a number of the horses in the race that do like to hear their feet rattle, as they say, and it should be a good, safe surface. And
should never be an issue really with the Arabians, should it? They're very versatile and durable, and of course when we used to race at the likes of Hereford on a national hunt race courses during the summer, it would invariably be very firm ground anyway, so you'd be perhaps more worried if it was softer ground for the Arabians rather than firm ground.
Of course. And looking at the race, obviously we've got 8 declared. And who takes your eye in this? Bearing in mind that obviously it's your first handicap of the year to see where you are with your marks.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to be, putting forward horses as ones to follow in the race, but obviously the younger ones are very much of interest. Jamara, beg your pardon, she'll have her first start in a handicap, having run in probably 2 very good races last year, particularly the novice event at Wolverhampton that was won by Al Shamik. There were plenty of good horses in that, and they did sort of represent a slight regression from her debut, where she contested, similar race with the likes of Durgam Afbar in there, etc. Plenty of good horses in there. Seraphim Forte was actually behind Jamara in that race, but he'd had a couple more runs and had the opportunity to progress in handicaps, which he duly did at Wolverhampton on his final start last year. Thought he was quite impressive that day and had gone up £7 for his troubles. Did beat a fairly exposed horse in Samawat, and Zayn Zyperian will try and reverse form from that race. So it's basically Seraphim Forte, Zayn Zyperian. They're the 2 progressive horses in the race, and then Jamara will be having her first start in a handicap. So it's going to make life, I would say, fairly tricky for the more exposed horses in there, such as Al Montha, Al Jawahir, and Bin Al Ri, who amazingly, I think going back 2 or 3 years now, when I was looking through the Dubai Day handicap, the 0 to 75, Bin Al Ri was probably one horse I was a little bit worried about, because he'd shaped pretty well at Chelmsford the time before in finishing second, and I felt he was one horse ahead of his mark going into the Newbury race. He ran really well to finish 4th, but ever since then his career's not quite gone in the manner that I thought it would. So if he can bounce back, then he'd be of interest. But I think the 4-year-olds are going to be very competitive here, and Peter Hammersley's stable, Zions Appearing, will probably need to run that a bit more than those 2.
And going back to Bin Al Ri, actually, so when I went to see Pete, one of the things that I noticed was that the horses did sort of seem a lot more forward than perhaps they'd been at the same time last year. And I asked him whether he changed anything, and he'd said that the only thing he's doing differently is he's got some different hay. Whether that'll make the difference or not, I don't know, but they certainly look slightly different specimens to last year. He said, particularly in the case of Bin Al Ri, because like you, I thought that he certainly looked a good one for that handicap on Dubai Day, but has obviously gone backwards quite a lot since then. Pete feels he just hates Wolverhampton. And to be fair, last year that was the only place he could pretty much run. So we can cut him a bit of slack for that. He expects a better run at Bath on the turf. Whether that will be, I can't see that it's going to be enough for him to break his maiden, but it's interesting to note going forward. And obviously we've got a wider selection of racecourses this year other than just Wolverhampton, so that should be in his favour.
Well, it's a good point about the turf, isn't it? He's ever since that Newbury run, basically he's had to put up with Wolverhampton and Chelmsford, and as we've heard from quite a few trainers really over the years, not all horses seem to handle that kind of springy surface, I suppose is the best way you could describe it. So he'll be interesting back on the turf, and like you say, last year it would have been difficult for most of the trainers to really know when the season was going to start first and foremost, and perhaps the more amateur trainers out there that do it more as a hobby would have found it that bit harder to get their horses ready for a specific time. So I think there'll be quite a few horses in that same boat that will probably show a lot more this year than they did last.
Yeah, certainly the choice of racecourses should help one or two. And there are actually quite a few in this race that have never raced on turf at all. Dina Bint Crayon, for example. I mean, I think it would be a huge leap forward if she was to show something this time, but she's one of them. Gurko de Tournelle, a French import last year, he's not raced on ground faster than good because obviously he's come from France. So it'll be interesting to see whether he can spring forward, one for fully acclimatizing to living in the UK and our conditions here, and also to the quicker ground. We'll soon know, won't we? It's
was a tough introduction, wasn't it, for that horse last year? Gurko to Nell ran in the Group 1 at Doncaster on his first start, and then found his way in maidens. So hopefully that horse I see is ridden by Holly Doyle, which is quite interesting. So yeah, there's probably scope for one or two of these to improve, isn't there?
Well, you would hope so, and with it being the first race of a more structured season when everyone's had a chance to prepare, and rather than the stop-start situation we had last year, which is inevitably going to affect some horses' programs. It can only be a welcome start to the season, really. For those of you who wanting to be following the results and so on, I think it's only fair to say that British racing, including Arabian racing, is going to be following on with the social media blackout, which is going to take place this weekend. So for anybody expecting to see the results on Twitter or Facebook, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. The results will be posted on the Arrow website. If you go to the Arrow main page and select the racing data tab, that's where you'll find the results, including the video and the full results of the race meeting for that race there. And I mean, Stephen, certainly, obviously, you have experience of social media in several different countries, and I think that this is something to be applauded, really.
It's obviously horse racing is following the lead of other sports, and I suppose the first thing to say is that it's unfortunate for horse racing that it falls on this weekend, because obviously with the Guineas kicking things off. But yeah, look, there are plenty of idiots out there, unfortunately, as is often the case, spoiling it for everyone else. They think they can hide behind a laptop and throw abuse. And look, most people, 95% of people, I guess, can take it on the chin and just brush it off. But the 5% still represents a huge number of people who can't, and it does affect them mentally. And it's just an unnecessary whatever you want to call it. So not quite whether 2 or 3 days off social media is going to have too much of effect, I don't know. But they've got to try something, and like I say, just unfortunate that it means that one of the biggest weekends in British horse racing is going to go largely under a blanket. But so be it. As I say, they've had to follow the lead of football and other sports. So yeah, it's something that you have to put up with. You shouldn't have to put up with, but do. And quite what measures can further be taken to prevent it from happening remains to be seen.
I still think it's a positive move, but as you say, it's a brave shout to join in on one of our biggest meetings, biggest weekends of the year for the sport. But then that does send a very strong message. Is posing. I mean, and also it's worth noting that the racing blackout is going to start a little bit later. Ours is going to start at 9 p.m. this evening, because there's Cheltenham has its annual Hunter Chase meeting. And they're having a tribute to Lorna Brooke after the last race, I believe. So interestingly, Lorna Brooke, she did actually, although she's best known as an amateur who rides over fences, or who rode over fences in this country, she did ride in the Sheikh of Fatima series. She had a ride in Bahrain and a ride in Poland. And obviously it's a huge loss to amateur sport, that she tragically lost her life in the fall at Taunton.
Yeah, indeed it was. It just shows how dangerous the sport is. The only sport where its participants are followed by an ambulance is a well-trawled outline, and it's obviously desperately sad. Thankfully, it's a fairly rare occurrence, but there are plenty of other jockeys who suffer serious injury as well. So hopefully, they'll do her proud at Cheltenham today.
Our next meeting, we're back to the maidens again. That's going to be on the Tuesday, the 11th of May. We're taking our first trip to Chepstow. So that will be the first maiden actually with a chance for horses to get onto turf. Chepstow is quite a challenging course for some of the horses making their debut. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, well, I expect we'll see one or two that ran last week at Wolverhampton probably go back there and have the run on turf. You mentioned the different surfaces. I mean, there's no real scope. I think we tried it a good few years back, having different marks on turf and all weather, but it's not really sustainable with such a small population of horses. So we're happy to keep them going on one mark, but I'm guessing, yeah, most trainers will be a lot happier to get them on the grass. But you know, I think we've still got to be very thankful for places like Chelmsford and Wolverhampton that they've largely kept the Arabian show on the road the last few years.
We must be hugely grateful, particularly to Wolverhampton, because we'd have barely had a race last year, really, unfortunately. But you know, that such is the way of the things, and at least with the all-weather surfaces, they are safe and consistent, and everybody knows, you know, what's going to be there. There's no quick going changes because of, you know, adverse weather between declaring and arriving on course. So, you know, I think it's a valuable addition to our sport to be able to use the all-weather surfaces.
Yeah, I think so, particularly with the maidens. I mean, crikey, go back again a few years and you see them flying around places like Hereford, and you know, there's no railing in most of the places. You'd often see horses flying off in all different directions during a race. So I think the more structured all-weather tracks, for all, you know, they're just round basically, aren't they? There's it probably teaches them a little bit more than the wide open expanses that you would get on turf courses. So it's it's very much been a good thing. And like you say, consistency, surface, you know, it's not going to be rained off at all. So yeah, definitely a useful addition to us.
Of course. So we'll bring this edition to an end. Thank you very much, Stephen. And we'll look forward to finding out who we've got declared in our next maiden.
Thank you.
Thank you.